Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for a webinar entitled Start with Hope, but Don't Stop There, Conversations on Black Recovery. We'll be starting in just a moment, but in the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. I'm Yulin Song, pronounced she, her, and I'm a project manager at the National Council for Mental Wellbeing, joining from Washington, D.C. We'll give folks just one moment to join us. Right. I see some folks introducing themselves in the chat. Welcome everyone. And it's great to see everyone's faces as well. All right, well, we have a lot to get through today, so we'll just go ahead and get started. But next slide, please. Welcome again. Before we dive in, just a couple of disclaimers and reminders. This initiative and our work with the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence is made possible by support from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Substances Administration, and the views represented by our speakers and moderator today do not reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide, please. And here's an important reminder slide on being mindful of our language as we discuss addiction and substance use today. The words we use absolutely do matter. And if you're interested in a resource on intentional and destigmatizing language use around addiction and substance use disorders, we will drop the link to Recovery Research Institute's Addictionary here. All right, next slide, please. We'll also take a quick moment to introduce the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence, Peer COE for short. One of the main purposes of the Peer COE is to provide technical assistance to organizations to enhance the field of substance use peer support services. For more information on what kinds of technical assistance you may be able to receive through the Peer COE, please check out this page on our Peer COE's 5 focus areas, and we'll be dropping that link in the chat as well. And here on the slide, you see the process through which you can request TA with us. All right, next slide, please. Just a couple of really quick housekeeping notes. This presentation will be recorded. We ask that you please stay muted unless you're speaking, and please introduce yourself with your name and where you join us from. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions and comments, and we'll be able to address them in the live Q&A portion of the presentation today. And we always greatly appreciate your feedback, so please complete the survey at the end of the presentation. The link will auto-populate upon your Zoom exit. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's today's agenda. We'll have a quick moment of introductions and framing, discuss Black recovery and the historical context, diversity within the Black recovery community, talk about the future, and have a moderated live Q&A before closing. Next slide, please. The learning objectives of today's webinar are that through the facilitated discussion, panelists will explore the current and historical context of the Black peer recovery movement, examine interactions between trauma, racism, and recovery, discuss the language of Black recovery, and envision a more equitable future of Black peer recovery supports. Next slide, please. And before we meet our panelists today, I want to introduce to you a national public service advertisement campaign called Start with Hope, which you might notice inspired the title of the webinar series. The Start with Hope campaign aims to reach all audiences at risk for developing or living with a substance use disorder, with a particular focus on reaching Black and Hispanic and Latinx populations. This campaign is informed by the reality that there are unique disparities that Black and Hispanic and Latinx communities face in the United States, and that there continues to be a need for culturally informed communications and resources to support these groups. The campaign seeks to inspire individuals with the motivating power of hope and empower them to start their recovery journey by connecting them with harm reduction strategies and culturally responsive treatment resources, which can be found both in English and in Spanish at startwithhope.com as well as comienzaconesperanza.com. And you should be able to find those links in the chat. And today we are going to play for you one of the short videos from the campaign. Next slide, please. All right, here is Joseph's story.
When you look to hope, there needs to be something tangible there. My connection to substance use disorder is that I have it, and I am now a person in long-term sustained recovery from it. When I don't have anything else, hope can't be intangible. That's not enough.
Let us use this life and this light and these words as a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever considered themselves a lost cause.
Until people started recovering out loud, people like me didn't understand that they had allies out there, that there were spaces that they could go that were safe.
We fight for the breakers and the broken, for the damaged and the damagers, for the feared and the fearful, so they know that they are not alone, that we are all here hurting and healing together. We fight.
So when I tell people like poetry saved my life, hope can save your life, it's not a platitude. I knew that I had something that could help, and I chose to lean into that something, and a good thing came from it.
That is always so powerful. As I shared, you can find more of information and videos. Courtney, thank you so much for dropping the links in the chat. I highly encourage you to go take a look on those websites for more. But on this note, I would like to turn it over to Aaron Williams on the line.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion today. I'm excited to be your moderator for today. And before we jump into this, I just want to take a moment to both introduce myself and also our all-star panel here today. I'm a senior advisor here at the National Council for Mental Well-Being. I've been with the council about 12 years now. And I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, Nyla Christian, who's the Executive Director of the Center for African American Recovery Development. Annie Powell, who's the founder and CEO of One World Recovery Network. And our own Phil Rutherford, who is our strategy lead of substance use at the National Council for Mental Well-Being. Thank you all for being here and joining us today. So I want to jump into this as we sort of talked about this, and Ulim did a great job of setting the stage for this. This is a panel discussion, but at the end of this, we'll also have opportunity to take questions from the audience here. We want to try to make this as engaging as possible. So if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat, the Q&A box. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can towards the end of the session. We are moderating and looking through the chat. So if something comes up that makes sense for us to put into the conversation, we'll do that as well. And so just to begin to kind of set the stage for this and really talk about why we ended up doing this in the first place, I think for many of us over the last decade or more, we've seen, and certainly lots of resources have been put into the opioid crisis across the country. But we have also seen over the last 10 to 15 years, some shifts and changes in that crisis. Now we're seeing a lot more synthetic opioids, fentanyl in particular, that is adulterated the stimulant supply in this country. We've also seen some demographic changes as we think about, all that's happened over the last 10 or 15 years or more, where we've seen shifts in terms of the number of people who are dying or at risk for dying from opioids. Move away from more rural white communities, and now in lots of both rural and urban areas, certainly a number of Black and brown people are dying at higher rates, because of the opioid crisis. But I think what spurred us to have this conversation is the fact that sort of lost in this, conversation about the opioid crisis and about what do we do about substance use in general, is the discussion of recovery. In particular, recovery for those who are not necessarily a part of the dominant culture. And so we wanted to take some time and really highlight what does Black recovery look like, specifically recovery for Black people? What does that mean? What does it look like? How has it changed or shaped, or how is it even shaped in this country through years of, for lack of a better term, racist public policy, and other, nuances of the society. So I think we have a great group here to really talk about this. And before we jump into, that sort of core context of the session today, I wanted to give each of our panelists just an opportunity to more formally introduce themselves, but also talk about how they came to the work. So I'll start with Annie. She's the first I see on my screen here.
Thank you, Aaron. Good afternoon, everyone. As Aaron has already introduced me, my name is Annie Powell, the founder and CEO of One World Recovery Network. I am also a person with lived experience of growing up in a Black family and a Black community, especially during the time of the War on Drugs campaign. So I'm deeply, deeply honored to be a part of this important conversation. My work in this field of recovery and support services is truly driven by my passion for helping individuals and communities, especially helping them to overcome the challenges associated with substance use, mental health challenges, and the historical trauma that our communities have experienced. I, along with other Black leaders, are committed to amplifying the voices and experiences of our community, ensuring that our unique journeys are recognized and supported. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Phil, what brings you to the work?
Well, as you said that question, I was thinking, did I come to the work or did the work come to me? And some of my life experience is really what brought me here. I don't recall as a small child thinking that this is what I wanted to do when I grow up. But I found that I'm also a person with lived experience, and I found that even after finding recovery, that I wasn't enjoying my life in the same way in the corporate world as I was volunteering, right? And so I found more joy helping other people find recovery than I did doing anything else. So it seemed like a good move. Now, what happened after that? That's a whole story for a different day. But I landed here, and I discovered along the way that my recovery journey didn't look exactly like other people's recovery journeys. I'd hear stories about people getting stopped by the cops and brought home, and the only place the cops ever brought me was not home. That's not where they brought me. And just like stories about being given the benefit of the doubt in cases where that wasn't. And again, that's not a question of whether or not I deserved it, but I started to notice some of the differences, and then hear stories about, well, we're all exactly the same. And while the condition itself may be exactly the same, the way in which I recovered and my life experience is different. And so that's kind of that's what made me passionate about this specific segment of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Nyla, what brings you to the work?
Hi, thank you so much, Aaron. I concur. I agree. I'm glad to be here. I feel like I'm amongst not only my esteemed colleagues, but I feel like I'm amongst family. So my name is Nyla Christian. I am the executive director of the Center for African American Recovery Development. I'm also a proud founding board member, which means a lot to me. I am a free Black woman in long-term recovery, and that means that I'm on a full, long, deep, really, really texturous journey with wholeness and wellness. I come to the work as a person with lived and living experience. What that means to me is that I had a journey, not only of my own, but also as the child of as an adult child of people who were on a search for wellness in a community where the role models for what wellness looked like did not look like us, where access to treatment and substantive conversations around wellness and behavioral health were not really something that was happening in the community. And when I look back on how I got to the world of recovery, I always felt invited, but never really included. I felt as though the doors were open, but I was never really warmly embraced, and I didn't see anybody in the rooms who had the likeness of me. And so the way that I get to this work and the way that I stay in this very, very interesting and oftentimes complex work is I stay ready for my sister who's on the other side of the door. I believe wholly in being available for Black women who are seeking and searching out pathways to wellness and wholeness and newness. I love coming behind Joseph's very resonant opening. It really gives me chills. So I'm glad to be here as well. And I'm ready for this great conversation.
Well, thank you. We're glad to have all of you here today. And each of you, I think, in your own way, have talked a little bit about this, about your own personal journeys, and also the context in which we as Black people live in this country. And I talked a little bit about this, thinking about public policy, and Annie, you mentioned this, the quote unquote war on drugs. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time here just talking, and getting your thoughts about, some of the historical context. We think about, the war on drugs and the public policy, that was essentially racist. And we also think about, language and the use of terms like addict, and how, terms are used, particularly towards Black and brown communities, and particularly the Black community, and sort of the mistreatment that's happened over the years. So I just would love to get you all's take on thinking about how the war on drugs has sort of shaped the treatment and recovery of Black people in the U.S. I don't know who wants to jump on that one first.
Can I start with when I was prepping for this, there's a question specifically around the war on drugs and policy.
Mm-hmm.
And with your permission, I want to read a quote because I really think it frames up what we're talking about and how we got from sort of we'll call it a permissive drug culture in the 60s to where we are now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and this is, I won't tell you who said this quote until the end, but I want to read the quote. It says, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And that is a quote from a gentleman named John Ehrlichman, who was a domestic advisor for Nixon. And sometimes when I talk about Ehrlichman, the response that I get is, well, that was 50 years ago, and it was a long time ago, but that structure set in place a train, it set a train in motion that even though the Carter administration was a little bit less hung up on drugs like cocaine, they were still pretty anti-heroin. But that is what permitted an environment in the 80s that created the 100-to-1 sentencing component of crack. And so we didn't get to where we are today as it pertains to the war on drugs, or the failed war on drugs, or the war on Black people, whatever you want to call it. That war, we didn't get to that without a starting point. So I think it's relevant that we look at the starting point of that, and because we don't have a ton of time, we can't talk about the 40s and 50s and the 20s in Harlem and the 1800s on the West Coast. But there is a pattern in this country of racializing drug policy, and we are experiencing for the past 50 years, we've been experiencing this particular component of it.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. I appreciate that thought. Yep.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead, Annie. Well, as a Panther Cub, we were just talking about this prior to jumping on. As a child of the Black Panthers, the narrative of criminalizing resistance, period, in our communities is so interesting. But the narrative of criminality associated with substance use has the stigmatization has created ripples in our community. And just to sort of bring it to present day, because as Phil said, we need a good week-long series. Well, we need a lifelong series to talk about the history. But if we were to stay within the boundaries of what we have here, it makes it harder for Black people to embrace recovery when the juxtaposition is the criminality of substance use disorder to begin with. So I think that there's a rub internally in the community, as well as dealing with the images of us paraded across many media outlets with as addicts and animals during the quote unquote crack epidemic and the war on people, as opposed to the compassionate approach we have now with opioids. So it's a very interesting dichotomy.
Just piggybacking on Nyla and Phil, it makes me think about like how old I was in the 80s and 90s when this was taking place. How on one end of the spectrum, drugs are being flooded into our community to destroy our community. But on the other side of that, I saw Black men in my community that could not find jobs, that were unable to provide for their family, also see this as an opportunity to get out of poverty, to be able to provide for their family. And with that dangling carrot before them, I saw that these systems begin to exploit the very thing that's supposed to be helpful. Creating a space for safety for our communities was also used to harm us. And that created even more distrust, not just of the system, of each other. So where in Black communities, there was community and support and trust, it got to the point that it was a war. We were fighting one another. It was destroying our families. And it was all outside of the context of our control, because we wanted to just have a better life. So the powers to be, like Phil said, it was a strategy all the while.
Absolutely. And we could actually, push that forward into the after effect. We lost a generation and a half or two to the war on people. And we are still suffering in a sense of, trying to create family systems, community networks around the broken pieces that we have to pick up after the mass incarceration, during that war on drugs / people. So it's interesting. We're still feeling the reverberations of that, I think.
Nyla, you touched on a great point as a good sort of segue as a part of this conversation. These things have consequences. Like there is a ripple effect and trauma that has happened within, this community, and I would argue larger communities. These things hurt us all in some ways, but in particular, the Black community. Just talk a little bit about, how we think about, this idea of trauma and how that has played a role in both treatment and recovery within Black communities.
I think we can just go back to the historical trauma, generation over generation over generation. The trauma and the racism, the discriminations have compounded the difficulties that Black people are facing in our communities, in the recovery process, the insurmountable barriers that we face, even access treatment of any kind, the injustices that contributed to the pervasive sense of mistrust and disempowerment. This place that was considered our communities were so safe. I remember like going home and Miss Molly on the corner would watch you all the way to your yard to make sure you were okay. And if you were misbehaving, your mom knew by the time you got there that you were misbehaving in the streets. So the trauma impacts our mental health and well-being. And we lean to substances to cope with the stressors that we're facing. And through that, some of these factors creates a place where there's no way out. There's no way out.
Yeah, and I want to add to that, because I think you said something really important, Aaron, and I just want to lift it up, because a lot of times when we're having conversations like this, we are talking about harms done specifically in the Black community. We're talking about a drug policy that we know was damaging to the Black community. Unfortunately, and again, we would need weeks to unpack why this is a common belief in America, but the common belief is that there's some sort of zero-sum game here, right? That there's some sort of like, we're talking about Black folks, and if we get this thing, if we focus all this energy on Black folks, that some other group will lose. Or if we focus all our energy on the Latino community, some other community will lose. And I would posit that all communities lose. Because the Black community has been so traumatized by drug policy, all communities have lost. Because of what happened in the first wave of the opioid crisis between 2000 and say 2010 with prescription opioids, the Black community lost because the white community lost. And there's this notion that we're somehow different and each group has to fend for themselves is a falsehood, and it's also counterproductive. I think what we're saying here is that there are specific harms that were done. There are specific interventions that we probably need to apply to address those harms. But I just want to, like, I don't always get that feedback directly, because some people won't say that to me, but sometimes I'll hear that separately or get a text that questions that, and that's not the case. This is about all of us. We're examining the Black community as a community that is a part of all of us. And it's really important to understand. If you don't think of it that way, if you think of it as them, if it's them, then we're all in trouble. It's not them, it's us. I'll get off my soapbox now. Sorry.
Well, I'll jump on the soapbox with you, Phil. Just give me some room up there, and I'll jump up with you, because I hate to sound trite, but we actually are all better together. I mean, we actually are, and that's the truth. But I just got to take a quick tick back to what Annie was saying, because the wonderful thing about the work that we do is there is a personal impetus here, right? There's a reason that I'm here, and there's a reason that I'm so deeply embedded, and my life is interwoven in the work that I do. I'm thinking back to the early 80s, right? And Annie hit it, when communities were communities. I grew up in a little country in New York called Harlem. And let me tell you something, you couldn't get away with anything from river to river. That's absolutely for sure. And I remember being, a tween ager somewhere in there when crack hit the streets, and it completely disrupted the energy and the synergy of our communities. I remember being a young, a young person, and watching what the way in which it twisted not just our communities but my own family. I remember very specifically, we're talking about the mistrust and the distrust of systems that are built actually to support and to help us and to help all. And I remember very clearly my mother explaining to me that you don't tell anyone. You absolutely do not tell anyone, because of the mistrust and distrust of seeking culturally competent care, explaining to the dominant system and the dominant culture the joys, the successes, the woes, the struggles, the resilience of a Black woman during that time, doing the things that needed to be done. Annie hit it. I'm very sure my mother sought her own relief, as we do, folks who are challenged with substance use disorder, once, seeking that relief, seeking that comfort, seeking that safe space that she wasn't afforded in her world as she pieced together making $1 out of 15 cents. She found relief, and then the relief got beyond her. And so I take this work very, very personally when it comes to how it's affected our communities, affected our families, and the lack of being able to find folks who look like us and understand our experience. I think it's a very important piece, and I know you need to segue, so I'll give it back to you, Aaron.
No, it's quite all right. I think this is the core of the conversation, and I think you're bringing up a critically important part of this, leading into the conversation around stigma, and how we are able to navigate a substance use disorders generally are highly stigmatized, but then also being a part of a community that has been stigmatized, like how that adds layers to not just sort of the impact, but also how we think about treatment and recovery options for people. And so I don't know if you all want to comment just about sort of this idea of stigma and how to begin to kind of sift through some of the layers of that, both the substance use and also being a part of a community that has been marginalized for so long.
Well, just to set the tone, I have a question for the audience, and it doesn't require an answer. I just want people in their heads to picture opioid overdose vigils. And I'm not trying to make light of them. It's tragic events, but we've all seen them. There are pictures of so many people that have lost their lives to an opioid overdose. Now, as you're picturing them, I would like for you to tell me how many faces on that picture board look like me. That's stigma. And because the thing is, the numbers are clear. The overdose numbers are relatively clear. We know who's dying, and we know the rate at which people are dying. So it's not that. But there is internal stigma within the community, and I can't remember if it was Annie or Nyla that touched on this when we started, but that thing of saying, hey, my kid has a substance use disorder and he lost his life, or she lost her life, or they lost their life to an opioid overdose. That's not really a thing that we do a lot of, because they're for a variety of reasons, over policing, mass incarceration, on and on. I don't have time for all that, but there's a lot of reasons why it's not a thing that goes on a lot in Black communities. But that is the power of stigma, that people aren't even honoring their dead because of what the perception of the cause of death might be. That's a problem.
Absolutely.
I'll talk about the myth of the, super Black woman. Talk about that for a minute. We aren't allowed to, there's no permission to seek help, to seek support, and Phil, just to kind of tie it back into those images of the opioid epidemic, I hate to call A&E out, but I've never seen an episode with a person of color on intervention. And I say that sort of, sort of tongue in cheek, just not to call anyone out, because I think it's time that we call people in. But I think that there's another prompt that we're going to talk about, Aaron. We're talk about, what does the image of Black recovery look like? And if we don't know, how are we creating those spaces? Because there is a stigma within our community, referencing, what the image of addiction or alcohol use disorder or behavioral health or mental health recovery, like what does that look like? So, I think that the stigmas, right, both internal and external, perpetuate the cycle of isolation, the cycle of silence, the cycle of silence, and it hinders us from forming our own communities, en masse around recovery and wellness.
No,
That's a really
I
good
think.
point.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Andy. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's a really good point that Nyla just made, because the opposite of addiction is connection. And so when we're struggling because of the stigma and we don't ask for help, then we're isolating and we're alone. And in those points, then we're probably not asking for help or trying to seek services. So it's so crucial, especially being a woman that retired her S on her chest. I so think that it's important for us to find those places of connection.
And there's a point that Joseph makes in his piece, and there's a point that Sister Ariel makes in her piece, and that Start with Hope initiative, and Ada, who's fantastic as well. But there's something that's so incredibly important, that Recovering Out Loud piece. I mean, I made a very conscious decision once I could firmly put roots down in this journey of wellness to recover out loud, so that my sisters had, permission and an invitation to do so as well. As we lead our community in, shouting from the mountaintops that, being not okay is okay. And the more community we create around that ourselves, I think the better off we are all together.
Absolutely. And I think, your points are well taken, and even, discussions around intersectionality and how that sort of plays into this is another piece of this conversation, which, certainly we could expound upon. As we think about this, and I think we've done a good job of kind of laying out, the historical context and sort of, what this has looked like in the country. But as we think about moving forward, plain and simple, people can and do recover all the time. And what does that look like? I think, the people on this call, and as part of this panel, have sort of been around the field of substance use treatment and recovery, before a bit. And, we have seen, what some of the structures look like, particularly in dominant culture, and also within Black communities. So it'd be nice, I think, if we just talk a little bit about some of the language of Black recovery, some of the diversity within Black recovery. I think as we were preparing for this panel, we had a pretty robust discussion about, what that looks like versus people who are recovering in more religious-oriented sort of community spaces versus not. So any of you want to just sort of, chime in about, some of the diversity within the context of Black recovery?
I like hanging out with the young folks. I like hanging out with the young folks. Keeps me young, keeps me progressive. I happen to be the mother of three, count them three, 25-year-olds. So they're like, I don't know, zillennials or something of that sort. But, you know, and there's a sister on this call who taught me something early on in my relationship with Hard, you know, very adamant about the language around recovery. And here's this idea that there's this like sort of binary path, you know, for the majority to recovery. And it was, you know, some of the 12-step mutual aid groups, and it held some language, and it held some, you know, some criteria around it as to, you know, whether or not you're in or you're out, you know, you are or you aren't kind of thing. And what an opportunity to learn and to grow, you know, with this new idea around wellness and around way upstream prevention, which talks really about, you know, primary wellness, primary wholeness. I'm on a journey of wellness, because oftentimes the language that's used by dominant culture doesn't really work in our community, and it also may be somewhat repulsive
I guess
in our
I'm
community. So I'm listening very closely. Yeah, go ahead, Phil. Go ahead,
oh
Phil, because I
sorry.
know I'm coming over to you. I know
No,
I'm coming to you because I know we talk about this.
well, I have a story that I apologize for those of you that know me. You've probably heard this story, but this was the most instructive thing that ever happened to me around recovery, because my journey was in the sort of traditional, you know, shut up and do what you're told, go sit in a room somewhere and listen to those folks. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a pathway right there. And we say all the time there are multiple pathways. But some years ago, I was at a recovery center, and we were cleaning it up. We were getting it ready to turn it into like a community room. And I was working. It was in a church, and I was working with another guy, and he volunteered for the church. We're working on the room, and we were sitting there talking, and much like everyone has said, I recover out loud. Just about anyone that knows me knows I'm in recovery, right? Because I can't keep my mouth shut. So we're talking, and I'm telling him my whole life story, which he didn't ask for, and blah blah blah. And he's, you know, he lets me get done. He says, "Yeah, I used to use heroin. I haven't used heroin in 10 years." And I was like, "Great, you're in recovery." And he's like, "Oh no, 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 I'm not one of them. I'm saved." And like it snapped for me. And for those of you who are on here that don't know what that means he's connected to a faith tradition, and he has he practices something associated with that faith tradition. But it snapped for me that just like my whole understanding of using substances or not, living a certain way or not, was based on a binary definition. And that conversation with him got me curious about just asking other people about their journey, and then got me curious about looking at data. And the data says that the majority of people that at one time met clinical criteria for substance use disorder and currently do not use the term recovery. And that's the majority. I'm not talking about Black folks. I'm just talking about the majority of people. So like our understanding of how we describe these things, and when we put someone in a 28-day treatment center and say, okay, you need to do this thing, and you need to come out, and you need to go to this particular place and do this particular thing, is counterproductive, especially when that place is not culturally responsive. I have a good friend that has done some research on Recovery Capital, and shared with me that Recovery Capital, the scores that in the study she was doing, were the Recovery Capital scores were actually fairly high for Black people, but the outcomes for those same people were poor because they were not staying in treatment, right? And we do know that there is a loose correlation between time in treatment and long-term success. So it's just like our entire understanding of this may be a bit narrow, and I really appreciate what Nyla had to say about like lifelong well-being, and approaching people from a perspective of lifelong well-being, and not what my narrow little tiny understanding of it is. And I've had more success working. I mentioned that I really like helping other people. I've had more success on an individual person-to-person level by taking that approach, and talking to people about what their life goals are, and where they want to be, and what they want to do, and what they want to stop doing, or what they want to start doing and what they want to stop doing. I've had way more success with that.
Yeah, so I love it because isn't that like the centered or the foundation of recovery support services, right? It's human work, it's heart work, HEART. And the way that we talk about it in Black and Brown spaces, especially with the young people do not, recovery and all of the terms that the OGs use, they don't resonate with that. I'm with you, Nyla. I have young people and they're like, it's just a journey of growth. They use words like well-being, wellness, healing, and especially, people of color, long before there were recovery movement, air quotes, we had our institutions, which was our churches, the moms on the street, the mother in the community, all of those kinds of things. As Black people, we healed, we connected in community. So when we're talking about what's the language that we should use, I have a friend that I've been on this recovery journey with for a long time, and she says, give a thing a name, and then it makes it tangible. Well, if you want to talk to Black people, then you need to ask Black people, what is the name that we've given to the thing? Right? So it can resonate with the research that's happening and being able to connect that to our very lived experiences.
No, absolutely. I think you're well taken. I think, these, varied experiences and, similar to Phil, I've had conversations with people where, they will mention things which to me would clearly indicate that they're in recovery, but they would not use the term. And they would, maybe use something else, but certainly, that sort of diversity of thinking about how, we talk about it, what that looks like. I think it's something that we, may need to explore more broadly in terms of, the work. And certainly, again, the role of faith and religion. Certainly, I know there's a number of faith-based community programs focused on recovery that people are engaged in. So that work still remains, and in a broad way, and thinking about the language in those broader terms, I think matters for all of us. So I want to shift gears a little bit here. I know as a part of this session today, we talk about this idea of start with hope. But I think it was important that we laid a bit of the context around Black recovery here. But I wanted to spend some time with you all, given your wealth of knowledge, talking a little bit about the future. Hope certainly, brings this opportunity to discuss the future and think about, what could be or what could change, for the betterment of all of us, not just Black people, but for all of us. And so I wanted you all maybe just to comment. We think about issues around equity. We understand resources are being put into communities to address substance use, always have, but we see, many more in terms of the resources being put in. And we think about all the issues around equity. We think about certainly issues related to criminal justice reform and other things. If you could imagine a future, a more equitable future for the recovery movement in America, what would it look like?
How long do we actually have is the question.
We
And I'm
have
gonna
some time, I think, for you to sketch out, what you're thinking.
go ahead, Phil. I'm gonna follow Phil on this one.
So one of the biggest challenges, spirit of full disclosure, I spend a lot of time thinking about systems and how to make systems work and how to make funding work and all of that. So my first thought is that we are operating in one of the most grossly underfunded segments of healthcare that exist. And some would argue that, so behavioral health is sorely underfunded. Substance use health is underfunded as well. I'll say it that way. I don't want to get anybody mad at me. So my outlook for the future is actually not as pessimistic as all that sounds. But the fact of the matter is, we are not in a serious way devoting resources to addressing our substance use challenges. I want to say it was 91. I can't, but please forgive me if I have the date wrong. But there was a thing called the Ryan-White Act. And the Ryan-White Act, the objective of that was to dramatically impact AIDS and HIV, right? So 10 years, there was a $100 billion investment agreed upon for 10 years by the federal government. I did the math. In today's dollars, that would be $243 billion. I want that. I want that level of commitment to this challenge, because I don't believe that with a grant program here and a bake sale over there and some good meaning folks out here in Bakersfield, like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think that is going to solve the challenge. I just did a talk with a guy named Ben Westhoff, who actually went to China and investigated the people producing the precursors for fentanyl. Prior to that, I had some little shred of a thought in my head that maybe one day we'll get on top of supply. We won't. We're not gonna. As soon as we make changes to what is an acceptable substance to be produced, the other actors in the drug pipeline change that. So we're not going to fix that. We have to fix the demand problem. I do not believe we can do that without serious investments in research, serious investments in availability and cultural responsiveness of training. And for this, I'm not talking about just Black communities. I think that there should be cultural responsiveness for anyone that wants it. And I want on-demand convenience care. So just like when if you get a little boo-boo on your hand and you need to go to urgent care, I want that for substance use disorder. Like, today's the day, I've had enough. I can't take it anymore. I want to go to urgent care for SUD. Like, I want that type of system, and that type of system would require that level of investment. That's one thing. I got more, but I'll pass to Nyla for now, or to Annie. No, I'm not picking favorites.
And I'm going to come behind. I'm going to come behind because I think that this, again, is a longer conversation. I like building on the root, the root cause of the problem, Phil. I 100% agree with that. I've got a list as well. Annie, I would love for you to jump in as I write through the list of what the future looks like.
Well, I think you muted yourself, Nyla. Sorry. Looks like you muted yourself.
You did.
Okay.
Wow, like Phil, that was loaded. What was Phil saying? Put your money where your mouth is. Yeah. So we're saying in our country, the current administration is like, yeah, we want to move toward a country that is recovery oriented, right? From focusing on the problem to focusing on the solution. So what does an equitable future look like around substance use in the recovery movement? Once we put the money there, I want equity, or I know that we need equity with whom is accessing the money. Oftentimes money comes, and for under-resourced, underserved communities, the dominant culture, because they have the resources, the infrastructure, they're able to get the money and then funnel that money to the people that are already in the Black and brown communities that are already doing the work. We are resilient. We do recover, and we will support other people recovering. So in a future, equitable access to resources, to funding, to the supports, helping us to build infrastructure. One of the things I did recently as the opiate abatement money came out is I started to have conversations with leaders around that money is being released. I get it. Some of the organizations or programs do not have the infrastructure to be able to receive those types of funds. But those individuals that do receive those funds, make it part of the grant process that they have to incubate and support those organizations that they're going to funnel the money to anyway, because they're doing the work in the community. They have the relationship with the community. So make sure when this money is gone, that the infrastructure and the supports necessary have been given to those organizations, because that's about sustainability. Like 100 years from now, if we're futuristically, we build the infrastructure around the people that are doing the work, then we'll keep doing the work because we're doing it now with no resources. And I'll hand it back to Nyla.
100. And just to come behind my brother and sister here, I'm looking at, you've said all that I've said in my notes and all that I was thinking, which is the joy of working with people who look like me and have had some of the same experiences I've had as a person in long-term recovery and as an advocate in long-term work and deep work in this community work. Addressing historical disparities, recognizing and rectifying the historical underfunding of recovery support services in Black communities, allocating resources that reflect the disproportionate impact of substance use disorder in our communities. I love this transparency and allocation, proportional funding, ensuring that the funding that's allocated to Black communities is commensurate with the level of need and the impact of substance use disorder. I love this. And this includes Black-led, community-led, peer-led organizations, empowering local leadership, providing grants and funding directly to Black-led, global majority-led initiatives, because we have a deep understanding. And Annie, I love what you said about capacity building and sustainable funding. It's great to drop an initial grant for a community-led project. But how are we sustaining that work, and how are we building infrastructure and thus led to the birth of CARD. That's actually what CARD is focusing on. How do we get up underneath these grassroots, peer-led, Black-led community initiatives with work that looks like the community and reflects the needs of the community? How do we get up underneath it and really stand it up so that it is sustainable, so that there is a bridge, so that we are leaving legacy? I think, this takes, there's no monolithic Black experience, right? So there's no way for us to collectively have this one. No, that's not true. There is a way for us to collectively have this one but diverse, voice and an agency in creating these policies and funding initiatives. We need to be at that table, but we also need to be given opportunities to access funding to create our own tables. So, our future is big. Our future is bright. I don't think it's inaccessible. Annie, I know I hit something there. I saw you. Go ahead.
You did. You talked about the tables. I'll say this, Aaron, and I will definitely hand it back to you. For anybody that may watch this webinar or may see it later, stop building tables, preparing menus and meals, and then inviting us to eat. You want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Start with us in mind. Invite us to the planning, build, ask. Can you just ask? We will show up and we will do the things with you. We're just asking you to stop doing them for us.
No, absolutely. That is a great way to frame this and to think about this. So, and you all touched on it a little bit here in terms of, what we can do to really, make that future possible. But if you wanted to leave, the group with one thing that we ought to start doing now, or one thing that we ought to consider now, to move us toward that future, what might it be? Like, what would be the first thing you would say, or the thing you'd want us to tackle? And I know Annie and Phil, you all shared some stuff in the chat too about other ideas, to create a more equitable future. But what is the thing that we could do now that can move us on that path?
Wow. Low-hanging fruit, right?
Yep.
I'm going to say this, and then I know it's going to ping Phil and Nyla. Nothing about us without us. And us, Black people, are we coming together in those recovery spaces? I think of CARD, the Center of African American Recovery. I think about One World. I think about Black Faces, Black Voices. I think about Black harm reduction. I think about ... There is a list of spaces for Black people to convene to talk about how are we moving forward to solve some of these issues in our communities. And we can do, what is the African proverb? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I would say low-hanging fruit, find your tribe. Find where Black people are already convening to solve some of these issues.
I just the go far or go fast alone, go far together. I have a very simple request for, and this is actually inside Black community work. If you're on this call or the Zoom and you know something about substance use disorder or recovery, I would challenge you to do two things. One is have a conversation about substance use disorder with another member of the Black community and challenge them to do the same. Because it is my belief we are not talking about this enough. We're not talking about the challenge and the just the legacy and generations of suffering specifically around this. Now, listen, there's plenty of generational trauma to go around, right? So we're not going to break the bank of generational trauma. There's plenty of that. But on this specific subject, have an open and frank discussion with someone that maybe doesn't have that knowledge or doesn't have that awareness of the thing, and see if you can get them to carry it forward. So kind of each one teach one, which is also a thing that it's also an African proverb. So
I'll jump on with an African proverb, Ubuntu, I am because we are.
Oh.
I absolutely will jump right in. Boom, here we go. That's why I said we're better together. I love that, Phil. Talk about it. If we're going to be about it, talk about it. Talk about it, be about it. Put our hearts and our minds and our souls, where our mouths are. And let's talk about the internal Black community building. In order for us to move forward, there's some things that I thought about that really are surrounding around stigma and around Black community building, establishing platforms and community events, which we're already working on, right? Where Black folks can share recovery journeys, leveraging social media, podcasts, local Black radio stations, partnering with major media outlets to address stigma within our communities, collaborate with influential Black public figures, activists, artists, to move the conversation out of the shadows, to move the conversation out of the the back doors and way back where we put the person in the family who's having the challenge, and we put them in the back somewhere or in the basement somewhere, but to move that conversation to, for lack of a better way of putting it, Annie, the table, right? And I mean our table. I mean our table where we break bread, where we come up with solutions, where we do that community healing. We talk about trauma-centered, let's talk about healing-centered community and solutions. So I think, the call to action would be less to call out than to call in our own community and do that inner work that we need to do. And then I think there's a bigger discussion and conversation to have with dominant culture and the greater community.
Thank you for that, and thank you all of you. For those comments. I think again, they're similar to Phil. I am not necessarily pessimistic about the future. There certainly is work to be done and things that we need to do, but they are doable as we move forward. And I want to thank our panelists here for all of their comments over the last close to hour or so on this topic. But now what I wanted to do is, invite the members of the community who are also on the call, who are listening to this, who are in the chat. Thank you all for your wonderful comments in the chat, and invite you all to pose some questions to our panel here. There are a number of questions in the Q&A, which I'll go through in just a second. But if you have a spark or a thought or something that that this has resonated in some way, jot down a question in the Q&A box, and we'll try to run through as many as we can. We may not have answers to all of it, but I think between this group, there certainly are some thoughts to consider. So we certainly can do that. So I'll just kind of run through what's here now as people begin to add some other thoughts here. One question says, do you see the possibility of development of not only harm reduction services, policies, legislation, but also harm correction in communities of color and culture?
Tracy Gardner in the audience, is that what's happening here? That must be what's happening. Black Harm Reduction Network. Let me get that.
Yeah, Tracy, she's sitting there waiting for a plug. Tracy Gardner, Black Harm Reduction Network. So that is already in motion. I know we can't do back and forth, but I'm curious about harm correction. Like when I read the term harm correction, I instantly think of the R word. So that may not mean that may not mean the same thing that you intended with your question. So I don't know how to answer that.
Other thoughts or comments? I think there is some movement there. You're absolutely right. Tracy Gardner and her group are moving on some of these. All right, so why don't we jump into another one here? I work with humans that are navigating reentry from incarceration. In particular, I work with the Black Prisoner Caucus inside of Washington State Penitentiary. Many who are facing unfair sentences from the war on drugs. We are starting to see some clemencies granted and are slowly getting these humans out. I would love to see some resources to bring back from this session. It's interesting that comes up. I think here in the DC area, there was, I think recently it just made the cover of the Washington Post here, the newspaper. The governor of Maryland just commuted or pardoned 175,000 people who were who had convictions related to marijuana. So that is something that's happening across the country, and people are beginning to look at that. I don't know if some of the panelists have any thoughts about some of that movement and about the importance of it.
I would also say that vote, and those who can't vote, make sure the people that can vote get to the polls. The other thing is there is a lot of work being done just across the U.S. Around people returning to the community. And so connecting with those organizations, I know that NatCon is going to put some resources in the chat box, but connecting with those organizations are going to be crucial because those organizations have some of the resources they've done the work in the community. You can get connected to bring that work to your community, because there's some best practices out there. All practices are not centered around person-centered, family-centered. So just make sure that you're connecting with those types of resources.
Yeah, I like stirring up trouble. So there's 100 people on the call. The federal policy takes a long time, but state and local, you can sometimes get stuff done if you go in there and make some noise. So I would add on to vote and show up. Who is your congressperson? Who is your state level House rep? Who is your state level Senate rep? What are they doing? What are their positions? Do you agree with them? Is it okay that they are opposed to every single thing that you want? Is there some group that you're connected with locally that you can make some noise? Like I recognize that we have gerrymandered the country into a place where it's sometimes hard to do that, but at least know if you're in a place where maybe swinging 50 votes might not make a difference. We found, I live in Minnesota, we found a place where 50 votes made a difference in a district that was not of my political party. We were able to swing 50 votes and get a House person to make a decision that was impactful to people on the ground. So I say start making trouble. If nothing else, make them be accountable. Make them answer a difficult question. Because why not? So.
Yeah, absolutely. The importance of sort of civic responsibility and engagement, right? Because those are the people who have those policy levers and can really change those laws. All right, so we have another question here. How do you recommend we approach this topic among coworkers? I see everything is political. I'm not sure if everyone agrees. Do you have suggestions on how to acknowledge systematic inequality with my team, given that it impacts the people we serve? Specifically wondering, as a non-Black person of color in almost an entirely white workspace. So how do you bring this up with teammates or colleagues when it's clearly relevant to the services you're providing?
I think that's a great question, and I love when our friends and allies and family ask questions of this sort, because again, it's about inviting in, not calling out. I know that there are a number of organizations, including the lovely Dr. Dietra and her organization, that specializes in really looking at how do we, and I actually have some friends in the audience who have including friends here, as a matter of fact, who have worked with Dr. Dietra, but both end partners is a great, I think, resource for that type of setting, that type of level setting, that type of organization and that type of atmosphere, and creating a milieu that allows for curiosity, that allows for solution, and that allows, again, for advancement, so that's one of the resources that I would offer.
What other thoughts?
I would just add that and I can say this from my own personal experience in trying to help shepherd an organization through that type of change. Pace yourself. I think that's so get some help, get some outside help, and pace yourself, which is Nyla said that, but it's a lot to take on as a single individual. It's not that it's not worthy work. It's absolutely worthy. But it is easy to get tied up in an us versus them scenario. That's why it's really important to have sort of an external validator for this work. And there needs to be some appetite, because the truth of the matter is, if there's no appetite for change, you might do better investing your energy in another group outside of your workplace that does have some appetite for change, because you can't, sort of old adage, you can lead a horse to water. But if there's some appetite, have at it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for those comments. And I think that's a pretty sort of common thought, I think, from many people who are in organizations and struggling to really, lay this conversation on the table, particularly when they see some of the relevance of it. Have another question here. Speaking of language, I work with a child protection worker today on a coaching call. He was struggling to engage the younger generations into joining our program. What are your thoughts about how we can better engage others? Certainly, I feel like this is a conversation that comes up a fair amount when we're, having some discussion sort of off camera. I know Annie, you and your team have had some thoughts about the engagement, particularly of younger people in this space. So, what are your thoughts about how do we think about engaging and having these conversations with others?
Thanks, Aaron. So I have a team that is in clinical services, right? So therapists, and we work with the Department of Family Services. And what the question that the person presented is so true, not just in our state, but in other states as well. What we found to be most helpful is educating the different systems about the language, about the work, especially around recovery support services. As we've mentioned here today, treatment is not the only way. There's multiple ways that people heal and get well. So taking this as an opportunity, as a teachable moment, an opportunity for you to educate others. And in that education of planting the seed, might 100 trees come up from that. So for the next child that they're engaging or the next family, they'll have that context around what is the appropriate language. This kid is not going to understand clinical language, legal jargon. So how might I communicate and connect with them on a human level? How might I see them as a human being? So this is kind of giving you some context around how might you educate those systems and those workers? How might I communicate with the family? How might I be a part of the solution and not just be the tool for solving the problem? So hopefully that was a little context around what they could do in supporting those workers.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So we have a couple more questions here. And again, thank you all for asking your questions. We'll try to work through these as best we can here with the amount of time we have left. So there were a couple questions, so I'll kind of combine these here. A couple questions related to the use of peer support specialists. Like, how do we, think through the engagement around peer support, within the context of, Black recovery, more equitable recovery, thoughts around sort of the use of peer support and how that factors into this.
I'll jump in. The idea of making that, going from contemplation to making that decision to engaging, in my own path of recovery, whatever that may be, and seeing me or Phil or Annie or someone of our ilk on the other side of the table is joyous. It's absolutely joyous. I'm thinking of some decades ago entering, that space myself and having to cleave off pieces of myself to leave them at the door because those weren't part of the stories that I could tell the person who was receiving me. But the utilization of peer support and what that means in the Black community is so incredibly important. I'm thinking in particular of, CARD stands up Black-led, Black-run RCOs. And of course, in an RCO, 51% peer-led, peer-run. So we're dealing with Black folks with lived and living experience at the helm, at the front, on the board, in the vanguard of moving recovery and the idea of recovery forward locally from a grassroots, organically growing Black recovery support, growing from the roots. And it's a fantastic thing. And when we talk about like what that looks like and what that means. The engagement with the community means, and my brother, I'll speak, one of my brothers down at New Orleans Recovery Collective, he says, one door, one family, one community at a time. He is at the forefront as a person with lived experience who is peer certified, who happens to also be clinically trained, but really he's able to engage the community in a way that the local government entity can and wants to, but he has some effectiveness that, is not really, the LGE is not really comparable to what a well-trained, well-focused, well-supported, supervised, and again supported peer can do. So I think peer support is invaluable to our community. It puts recovery at the forefront. It puts wellness at the forefront. It puts contemplating my use or misuse or whatever space that I need to or want to be on the spectrum of use at the forefront and accessible to people who are seeking support, curious, seeking answers to their own lives. So I think peer support is absolutely invaluable.
Yep.
I hope that answered the question.
If I can just tag on to what Nyla is describing, thinking about language, peer support, right? The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did a fantastic project around people with lived experiences. And when we're talking about our communities, being a person with lived experience expands who I am. And it doesn't single in, right, the current model, focusing on the problem. When we use words or phrases like people with lived experience, we're now talking about recovery capital, we're saying I have the resiliency and strength within myself. And so when we're talking about now states are funding peer support, therefore you can't have peer support without having peer specialists. And so the states are building infrastructure. So you now have SAMHSA with the national standards that will help develop and support the workforce. But to Nala's point of getting down to the community level and the grassroots, that's happening. It happens in community by people that live in that community. Oftentimes I see in the peer workforce that people that are not from that community are being hired and brought into the community to serve that community. That's an injustice all in itself, because when we're talking about supporting the community, I live in this community, so I understand the community. When you have someone from the outside coming in, you can tell this is my soapbox. It's not as helpful, although I identify with you as a person of color. And this is something I learned early becoming a peer specialist. I came from a whole different community, and I didn't understand the culture of the community that I was supporting. And I caused more harm than I did good. So if I could say anything about the training for peer specialists in our communities, the cultural element is important. The other thing that's really important is having the continued education and the supports of mentors and supervisors.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for you're talking a little bit about sort of where we are now and the lay of the land. You mentioned the SAMHSA with the standards. SAMHSA also now has a Office of Recovery that focuses on these kinds of issues. So that's certainly a part of this conversation. So we're getting close to the end. There are a few housekeeping notes at the end of this, but I wanted to just give each of you a chance to give maybe one final comment, maybe a quick takeaway that you want the audience to have. Certainly, there will be other opportunities here to continue this discussion and layer it in. I'll talk about that in a second. There'll be some open forums where we can discuss some more specific things. But I want to give each of you an opportunity just to say any sort of parting comment or thing you want the audience to go away with. Nyla, you're muted. Yep. So why don't we go with Phil? Phil, you can jump in since you're off mute.
Okay. I said the thing I already said earlier around making sure that we talk to others, but I think a key takeaway from this whole thing is I want to double down on this notion that working on that it's okay to single out a community and work specifically on the problems of that community. That's okay. And it's really important that we stop with the zero-sum game thought and think about how to lift up particular communities. I think that if we can get on that page, I think that we can make progress. To the extent that we can avoid whataboutism, it's important to me. And I think that we can, everything that we've talked about here today is doable. Maybe not the 243 billion. I don't know that's going to take some time, and I'm working on it. But I think that the sort of low-hanging fruit that Annie described and some of the stuff that Nyla described are things that we can engage in right away. So if you heard anything here today that you thought, hey, maybe I'll do that next week, please do. That's it.
And Nyla, we'll jump back to you if you're ready to.
Sure, I knew my mic was actually muted because I was just pulling in all of this good stuff that I've heard and thinking about what I would want to leave the audience with. And I'll just kind of pull in everything that we've been talking about and everything my colleagues have laid on the table. I truly believe in Ubuntu. I truly believe I am because we are. I truly believe in collective learning and working and community building, and that we truly enrich not just each other with, each of us have a capacity and a talent for building community. I think about the true nature of who we are as people of color, as Black people, and I think about how we community organize and how we build our families and communities on that. And I think what I would leave with is, bring what you got, and let us help strengthen and build your infrastructure in your particular community. Show us what works. Give us the information from the ground. If it's working in the basement of your church, let us know about it. If it's working in your community center, let us know about it. If it's working in your church group, if it's working in your fraternity and in your sorority, let us get behind you. Let us help you. Let us assist you in reaching who you need to reach and who is responding to your particular message. Because I truly believe I am, because of the sisters that brought me up through recovery and showed me how to do what I do for others. I believe we are definitely, I hate to sound so trite, but we are definitely better together. And so I would leave the audience with that. And lastly, I would say, Black recovery is about the readiness and the resilience of the global recovery movement. That's what I will say. We bring such richness to the table. And it's not a zero-sum game. Building the Black recovery movement helps us all.
Annie, any final thoughts?
Yeah. I think it's just an echo, right? So my final thoughts would be, it's essential to recognize the resilience and the strength inherent in Black communities, by understanding and addressing the unique challenges that we face. And I'm not talking about we as in Black communities. I'm talking about nationwide, global. We can create a recovery movement that's inclusive, equitable, and effective. We are stronger together. We can go further together. It's so much that comes out of that rich support that we can garner from the wisdom and knowledge and experience of the people that went before us and those that we're bringing along with us now. So if I could say that, we're stronger together.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us from the panel. If we jump to the next slide, I think we got a couple of things here. For folks who are still on the call, we would love to hear what you thought of this. So use your phones, your jot down the link. I think we dropped it in the chat as well. We want to get your thoughts with this brief evaluation of this training. There'll be some others. As a matter of fact, we're having a follow-up office hours on June 24th that you can register for. We put that in the chat as well. And also we're having sort of a broader part 2 discussion where we're talking specifically about providers navigating culturally responsive substance use treatment and care on June 27th. So we're going to keep this dialogue going. And again, we'd love to hear from you and your thoughts, as well as trying to help you directly through some office hours and other TA. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and we appreciate it. Thank you.